Most Georgians, as most Americans, have formed their ideas about Native Americans from the movies and from stereotypes about Western Indians, or particularly Plains Indians, and much less so about the Indians who lived in this area. In fact, it's very hard to break those stereotypes about expectations concerning Native Americans. The idea that Indians ride on horseback and have the rituals that we associate with the Plains Indians has found its way into our movies, and the Southeastern Indian culture, like most Eastern cultures, in fact, have sort of been passed over, both in terms of education and general public awareness. But I hope children in particular come away from this with the idea that before we were here, there was a rich and wonderful civilization that dates back thousands of years and which still has vestiges of that life in the present. Because Native American life goes on, it changes, it becomes more and different things.
The Sapelo Shell Ring complex was first occupied by Native Americans approximately beginning around 4,200 years ago. The site consists of 3 shell rings and an associated habitation area or scattered occupation around the rings. Now, based on the size of the ring, well, this ring in particular, we could estimate, a lower estimate would probably be somewhere between, I would think, 35 to an upper estimate of 120 people. And granted, that's a large range, and one of the things is it's just that it's very difficult to make population estimates. Now, it may represent a slightly larger population if, now there are 3 rings here, but we do not know if all 3 rings were occupied at the same time. If so, that would be quite a substantial population. And as it stands, this is one of the largest, if not the largest, archaeological sites of its time period here in Georgia. So it's quite a substantial site in and of itself. Before the time that the shell rings are occupied, early on from the last ice age up until this point, the general pattern for Native Americans was to live in small family groups, and they were fairly mobile across the landscape. In other words, they would move from place to place, move to the resources, move the people to the resources. Sapelo and other places have been interpreted as a sort of shift in this pattern, in that people are placing more importance on one particular place on the landscape, and in that they're not moving around as much. They're becoming less mobile, or alternatively, more sedentary. The first thing you notice right off the bat is there is a crap load of oysters, right? There's a lot of oyster shells. But buried within this oyster shell, mixed within this oyster shell, are the remains of some of the earliest pottery in North America. One of the things that we see throughout the world with this settling down is a change in the way people use technology and the emergence of new technologies. And we see that here at Sapelo. Sapelo Island has some of the earliest pottery in North America. And we associate often, in general, pottery with a gradual settling down. And there are a few different reasons for that. Some of the most obvious reasons for that is that pottery is very fragile. If you move around a lot with a very large pot, you're apt to break it. The other thing is that pottery takes time. You have to be close to resources. You have to process clays. You have to let the pottery dry. You have to fire it. So at the very least, you have to stay in one place that's close to these resources so that you can actually produce pottery. And then so once it's produced, you know, you're not apt to move around with it because again, it's fairly breakable. So we do associate pottery with sedentism in general. This is a shell ring, right? Circular. One thing that people have noted about the shell rings, and the early descriptions of them are, you know, it's sort of characterized them as being very symmetrical, kind of planned out. And as you can see, if you really start looking at this, I mean, it is a circle, but you know, the shell is at different heights. You know, it's not something that what you're looking at is sort of the end point of a series of actions by individuals over a long period of time. The shell ring is made up of many different layers, almost like a cake, although here we have a cake that one of the layers full of densely packed shell. Even though we see these very dense shell areas, that's not all that's in them. Again, there's just tons of tiny fish bones, terrestrial mammals, particularly deer, and other species that are from the estuaries, reptiles as well. I believe that the shell rings are located where they are for a few particular reasons. One, it's on the leeward side of the island. In other words, the side closest to the land. This would have provided protection from things like storm surge. If you're not right there on the beach, then you know it would have afforded a lot of protection. This is also one of the higher spots on the island, so it would be, again, not subject to flooding and things like that. Right back behind me, we have the estuaries. These are highly productive environments. Many different fish species, shellfish, all basically what you would need to subsist on are located right back behind me. The other thing here is transportation. In prehistory, the waterways are really the superhighways of Native American peoples. This would have afforded transport, contact with the mainland, also going to get resources on the mainland, such as stone to make stone tools. Shell rings occur as a worldwide phenomenon. Although they do occur in very specific areas, many of them are coastal. We find shell rings, of course, in the southeast, in the coastal areas, or near productive wetlands. They also occur in Japan, and incidentally, they also occur in Colombia and Peru. In Colombia, Japan, and the southeast, these are all associated with some of the earliest pottery in these areas. Contemporary interpretations of shell ring sites really fall into two schools of thought. The first being a gradual accumulation theory or a village place theory, in which people are actually living in a circular ring village and depositing their refuse to the side or to the back of their houses. The other school of thought is sort of the ceremonial mound interpretation, and that interpretation really holds that the shell rings were places where groups of bands aggregated, came together, had ceremonies, and mounded shell that were the remains of feasts and things like that, as an intentional monument. The most important thing that people, if they visit and take away from the Sapelo Shell Rings, is that it represents a point in not only Georgia prehistory of this sort of settling down, a sort of changing worldview, but something that is is a worldwide phenomenon. In other words, this is a sequence of events that happen many times in human history, and this is not only a part of the Native American history, certainly part of the Native American history, but it also represents a phenomenon that is part of human history. And it's something that we should realize our connection to and appreciate.
Stone effigy mound that is behind us is one of two such effigies or configurations that can be found east of the Mississippi River. Both of those effigies are here in Putnam County. This mound at Rock Eagle is from head to tail 102 feet high and has a wingspread of 120 feet. The Rock Hawk, which is located on at Wallace Dam on Lake Oconee, has a wingspan of 132 feet and is a little bit larger than the mound that we're looking at this moment. There's quite a bit of discussion about how old the two mounds are. Early archaeologists believe that it might have been as old as 5,000 years. However, more recent studies have determined they think it's probably 1,500 to 2,000 years old. Rock Eagle Mound was excavated in 1937 and 1938 by Dr. Kelly. Dr. Kelly thought that this mound was probably a part of the Hopewell Indian culture, which existed from, I believe, about 200 BC to 500 AD, and that Indian culture was found primarily in the Ohio River region, where there are also a number of other rock mounds, primarily the serpent mounds there. Again, in 1954, when the 4-H Center was being constructed, Dr. Vincent Petrilla from Venezuela did some excavation into this mound and found some burnt human and animal bone in the mound. There was also an ovate tool found at the site that was believed to have been part of the old quartz age, which is one of the reasons they believe that mound may have been as old as 5,000 years. However, archaeologists today actually think that the tool was probably just found in the area and added to the mound, or was maybe just laying on the ground here, and that probably the dating of the age of the mound from 1,500 to 2,000 years ago is more accurate. Most of the rocks that you would find on this mound are white quartz stones, which is a very common stone in the area, so they could have been brought from the woodlands around the area. Some of the stones are quite large, at a size that one person certainly could not move them by hand and would probably have to be drugged in skins and brought to the site. There were also different types of clay were found at this site. Those clays are not all found here in Putnam County, so some of those clays may have been brought in from many miles away. Both of the mounds are face east, and While we don't know why they face to the east, well, we know that the sun always rises in the east. If you look at topo maps of the area, you notice that we are standing on a relatively high point at Rock Hawk. It is also on a very high point up off the Oconee River. We're at approximately 600 feet above sea level right here. It may be just a little bit higher than that, and this is certainly one of the highest points in the county. Some people believe that it may have been a religious ceremony site. You know, a leader of the Native Americans that lived in this area may have been buried here. We don't know what the facts may be. Obviously, this site itself is a man-made phenomena that if it were constructed 1,500, 2,000 years ago, it took a lot of work. It would take quite a bit of manpower to build something like this today, even with using equipment. And to know that in that day and time, the rocks were probably brought here or drug here in skins, because there were no other way to get those rocks into this site. So just understanding our past is very important, and hopefully we'll always preserve these sites and others in the state and around the United States, around the world, that are important to the history of our society.
Well, the local Cherokees didn't know any more about it than we do. They had stories about it. It's a stone wall, approximately, 900 or so feet, stretching about the top of the mountain. I think it's not a fort because for one thing, there's no water inside this stone wall or anywhere around it. We really don't know. There have been excavations into that wall and they reveal nothing. In the middle woodland, we begin to find mounds, sometimes constructed of stone, sometimes of sand or earth, sometimes a mixture. And presumably, this is the time also when we had construction of things like the Rock Eagle Monument, the stone walls that were at various locations in the Piedmont and mountains. There's a stone circle here in Habersham County on Aleck Mountain. We believe these things are associated with the Hopewell culture, but actually we rarely find anything archaeologically to tie them to that period. Presumably they were inspired by the same religious or ceremonial motives. I wouldn't say they were built by the same people. I would guess they were built about the same time. For instance, a stone mound was excavated near the base of Stone Mountain. And it was one of the rare instances where we did find something inside. We found some pottery, which dates to Middle Woodland times, and they got some charcoal samples which yielded a radiocarbon date of about AD 400, which places it in the Hopewell period. Most of the time, though, when we excavate in these constructions, we find nothing. The stone circle here in Habersham County was investigated in 1959, and the archaeologists found nothing. Well, you know, they say that when archaeologists find something that we don't know what it is, we call it a ceremonial object. So my best guess is that it's a ceremonial construction of some type, but that's all we can say. We don't know. As far as I know, it's never been checked to see if there's any alignment in any way with stars or planets or anything of that nature, but that has been done at some other sites. And some of them seem to be aligned, such as some of the earth constructions in Ohio. But still, I would really have to be fair and ask, was that thing constructed with that in mind, or is that just a circumstance? Somebody went to an awful lot of trouble to build that. Not all of these are in inaccessible areas. Some are just on little hills or knolls, but I really would not speculate on their reasons for the choice of location. You see, these people left us no writing, so we don't know. We'll never know.
Kolomoki Mounds is set up as 7 Indian mounds. They're prehistoric, built between the years 250 and 750 AD. Well, it's thought that during the most of the year they lived somewhere either both north and south of here, then this might be some sort of central location or some sort of meeting place in a central point to gather in all the tribes from all around South Georgia, North Florida, and eastern Alabama. And basically they came here and lived anywhere from several weeks to several months at a time, and raised some crops and held the religious ceremonies on the large mounds and in this plaza that we're standing in right now. What you're seeing here is the layout of what it would have looked like at the time period that the Indians lived here. It would have been cleared of vegetation. Even all the mounds would have been cleared of any vegetation. Just the temple mound was cleared because it was good for the acoustics. You would have been able to stand on top and have a normal conversation with the people down below in just normal voice. Basically, you see the Indian mound, the temple mound, surrounded by the plaza, which is the open area here, and also the different village sites that have been found by the Lamar, the Wheaton Island, and Swift Creek cultures. Basically, it was just one huge compound with the plaza being in the center. They seem to think there was some games being played at Kolomoki here. There's a mound to the south of the large temple mound that they believe was some sort of like a gaming station. This is what you would have found if you would have came during that time period and saw what the Indians were wearing. These are shell beads that were thought to have been taken from somewhere down along the coast. And also they would have gotten the pearls for the ear ornaments off the coastal areas. And they would have traded somewhere up north to get the copper out of somewhere in the northern states. But the trade route would have proved beneficial in how to get all these shell beads and ear ornaments. Also, the higher status individual you were during that time period, the more shell beads and ear ornaments you would have possessed. This model is a representation of what happened in Mound D, which is the smaller mound out in the middle of the plaza. It was basically, when the chief died, it was a great event, and at that time they would have killed the 2 wives and the manservants to go to the next life to protect the chief. And also there would have been some offerings of this burial objects to come in here, and they built the burial objects in the shape of things from nature, and they called it effigy pottery. There was ducks, quails, owls, and items such as that. This is the kneeling human effigy. This effigy has human with his hands on his knees, and it also has an eagle on each shoulder, and it's thought to have been a fish in each eagle's mouth. It was one of the most exquisite burial objects found in Mound D. It's very important to preserve them so that our future generations can really learn about these Indians, and to make sure that all the artifacts that are still in the ground can get preserved, and all the mounds that get preserved, so that maybe future archaeology can tell us even more about these cultures.
The story of the Southeastern Indians is a story that is in bold contrast to what most people seem to know about American Indians. Native peoples who lived in this region were relatively peaceful, had a sophisticated political system. They were agricultural people. They had a well-defined system of government and social practice. They hardly fit the stereotypes that we're familiar with. The Mississippian culture is the culture that was in place at the time of European discovery and of De Soto's travels in the Southeast, particularly in Georgia. He said when he came into our region, the upper Etowah region, that everywhere he went, they were within sight of villages and seemingly large populations of people. This painting represents a scene in the Mississippian culture. The political figure in the painting is a woman, as was frequently true in Mississippian culture. Behind, you see important elements of Mississippian culture. It is in a riverway. It's agricultural, but primarily within the river bottoms. They also have a fishing element of their culture. Their culture has structure as exemplified by the mounds themselves. They represent the rise of generations of political leadership from one family dynasty to another. You also see the ball field. The ball field is sort of the social center of the community, and in the Mississippian culture and Southeastern culture, it's called the Little War, the way in which great issues are fought out, at least symbolically, in these ball games. These are also ceremonial grounds. This is such a rich and complex culture, and the interaction between the cultures has gone on for so many generations, dating back to De Soto and before in the early 17th century. These are so complex and interesting. I think we're just at the very beginning of understanding what all of this means.
Mississippian people arrived from somewhere else. We know this by the different pottery they brought, by the narrow-bodied arrowheads that were different than anything that had been seen here before. But most importantly, the three things they brought that changed society and the people who were here was the cotton, the corn, and the social living in large groups. Cotton, it supports an entire economy all by itself. Because where the cotton growers live is where the weavers live. And where the weavers live is where the loom makers and the string makers find employment. And if you're going to make seashell jewelry, you go live near the cotton growers because that's where the traders come to get the blankets. And you're going to be there to sell your seashell jewelry too. The pottery tells us a lot about who they were and where they came from, as does the products. Cotton and corn came from Mexico in the desert Southwest in the Four Corners area. Pottery of of shouldered bowls resembles the pottery we find out west. This site was a massive site, 1,500 to 2,000 people. There was a courtyard area between the greater and lesser mound, but much of what was here, we can't tell if there was a ball court area. There was certainly a gathering plaza between those two mounds. But since this area was used as a farm in the 17 and 1800s, much of the data is gone, destroyed by the plows and the cows of the dairy farm that were here. Well, we have 7 mounds here, and oftentimes the mounds are used for different things. The Great Temple Mound, the Lesser Temple Mound, these are social gathering places. Places that people got together for all the many reasons we gather in places where we don't actually live. Getting together for religion and ceremony to celebrate life. Getting together for the harvest. Getting together to watch the sky as it changes at night. Traders, getting up on top of this mound, could light a fire and let everyone down below know they were there. And religious leaders and political leaders could exemplify their power and their strength and their importance by living near or on these places. These mounds, back when they were used, would have had steps. On the Great Temple Mound, actually 2 layers of steps going up this side that's looking at us. They would have been covered with colored clays and kept free of vegetation. These mounds are phenomenal. The Great Temple Mound had buildings on top of it, a great place for people to gather. And it went up in stages, and we don't find much inside. The Funeral Mound had 7 different layers, and every imaginable type of burial, from log crypts, prone burials, flexed burials, even bone bundlings, where people partially cremated their ancestors and gathered their bones over time and then buried them together. The Earth Lodge is probably the most spectacular thing we have here at Ocmulgee National Monument. The Earth Lodge is a social idea, and it was a spectacular development of society and culture here. A circle of seats. And this was not the only one. There were 3 others here, which infers the need for social places like this. This was the largest one. A circle of 50 seats with a bird effigy built inside. It was a functional building, covered with dirt. It kept it cool. A hole in the center. The structure would not have raised up like a mound shape. It would have been flat-topped with a hole for the smoke to get out. In this structure, problems were solved, societies were planned, spirituality was celebrated, and the circle of life went round and round. It resembles much of what we do today and shows us a little bit that society in ancient times had many similarities rather than the differences we so often see.
The Etowah Indian Mounds is a prehistory site. It's a part of a larger group called the Mississippian culture. The Mississippian culture started around the Mississippi River, and it spread. This type of culture spread south and east, and it was a culture of building large flat-top mounds, having central plazas, and a type of pottery that was shell tempered. The Etowah site has 6 mounds, 3 prominent mounds and 3 smaller little mounds. It's about 54 acres. We believe that the peak occupation was somewhere around 12 to 1250 AD, and about 2,000 to 3,000 people lived here. The site is surrounded by a defensive ditch, probably had a palisade wall. When we did excavations in the 60s, we did find remnants of a palisade wall, which leads us to believe that they did have one entirely around the site. The ditch at one time went into the river on the west side, but not on the east side. We do believe that the site had a land bridge and lookout towers or bastions where they were manned to make sure they were not attacked by surprise. The site dates from about 1000 AD to 1500. This is what we believe is the temple mound. It was probably where the temple to the sun was on top of the large mound, and probably also where the chief priest resided on top of it. This was for the important person, the person who, the commoners who lived in the flat area felt like he was a god. So they wanted to get him higher and closer to their god, the sun. He would come out of his house each morning and he would greet the sun with a loud yell. And he would also show the direction for the sun to go after he had smoked his calumet and blown the smoke in the 4 sacred directions to him. It's really interesting, when we did the excavations in 1994 and they were testing for where the steps were, the original steps, we found a red clay, we found a yellow clay and a white clay. So it seems to me that it was very important to these people to bring this different colored clay to this person who lived here, because we believe that he was so important that they wanted to bring in beautiful clays to represent this mound. Mound C was the only mound completely excavated and then rebuilt in the late 1960s. The first excavations done was in 1880s by Smithsonian. Some of the artifacts that were found in Mound C were ceremonial items. These were funerary objects that were buried with the people. And there were long flint blades, there was copper axes, pottery, painted pots and pottery, and the marble figures. One was 2.5 feet high, one was 2 feet high, the male and female effigies. We do believe that these effigy figures might have been placed in the funeral temple, and at the time of the burial of these important people were later buried with them or interred with them. There was a copper breastplate that was found at the site, and it had an eagle being, or dressed as an eagle being in there in that particular design. Also, some of the shell gorgets had the eagle design. It was the eagle man, and that was a very significant symbol in the southeastern Indian time period. In the river, they would put fish weirs. They would put rocks in the river from corner to corner of the river bank, and it would be in the shape or form of a V. And at that V, they would leave it open, and then they could put a basket. And if you get into the river and you're scaring a lot of the fish and they're coming down through the rocks there, you could catch a lot of fish to feed a large population. They also used the hook and line. We have found at the Etowah site some copper hooks, fish hooks, so we know that they use those. Also bone fish hooks also. It is extremely important to preserve sites such as the Etowah site. I think that we as Georgians, we as Americans can learn from our past, and when you come here to the Etowah site, you can see a civilization that their legacy, you can see their artwork, you can learn from their experiences. And I think it's extremely important that we do a good job in preserving these sites.
Well, you have to wonder about the purpose of the people in constructing these things, and know that a lot of people have been here in Georgia before us.
It's real important that we remember that long before we came here, there were other people that is a sign at the entrance here says, live, fought, and loved. And I think it's just it's kind of humbling to me to think about those people and how they lived on the land around us.
We have only just begun to understand who the Southeastern Indians were, and I think that will become a major educational component in the future in understanding Georgia and its history.